The word sucker punch is derived from punch, that is, to hit someone with a closed fist, not the fruit drink, and sucker, a common term circa 1836 for someone who is a dupe or a rube, or in some way easy to fool. This slang was predicated on the use of the word sucker to mean a youthful mammal who is still sucking at its mother's teat and therefore too green to know anything about the world. Sucker punch as its own word was being used figuratively in 1929 and as a verb as early as 1942, according to the Online Etymology Dictionary, though I couldn't find a reference as to where it might have showed up in writing that year. There is, however, clear documentation of its early use in formal combat in the world of boxing. Jack Dempsey, a boxing commentator, mentioned the term in his book Championship Fighting, which was published in 1950. By his definition, a sucker punch is a blow that surprises the recipient who might have otherwise dodged or blocked it. So if a boxer hits their opponent with their offhand unexpectedly, that would be a sucker punch by this definition. Whichever definition we are adhering to, the general vibe of the word sucker punch tends to be a negative one. You might be considered clever for going all Rocky II on your opponent and switching up your dominant hand during a boxing match. But it's still a move that feels a bit more like a dirty trick than a legit way to win. It's asymmetric warfare, not a fair, by-the-book duel. It's also often used to imply villainy. In movies, in comic books, in television shows, in fiction of all kinds, we'll often see the bad guy sucker punch the good guy, while the good guy, more often, will face their opponent head-on, will fight fair. Another term that has been used in place of sucker punch in past decades and in other countries is coward's punch. We want our heroes to be brave and valiant. We want them to fight fair and to win through strength and skill, not trickery. In November of 2001, a boxer named James Butler, who bore the nickname the Harlem Hammer, ended his boxing career by sucker punching his opponent, a man named Richard Grant, after the bout had ended in Grant's favor. Grant was knocked out as a result of this attack, and Butler was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and went to prison for 4 months. It may at first seem strange to see a boxer legally charged for punching another boxer while in a boxing ring, but it goes to show that even in a place where punching is not just common, but required, the wrong punch at the wrong time can still be considered out of bounds. The conversation that I want to have today begins with a sucker punch, but it quickly expands into a larger discussion about ideology, about free speech, and about violence. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Let's Know Things is brought to you by people like you, its wonderful listeners. If you are picking up what I am putting down, consider stopping by letsknowthings.com, clicking on the contribute page, and considering the options presented therein, by which you might help support the show. This can mean something as relatively simple as stopping by iTunes and leaving a review or sharing the podcast with a friend. It can also mean contributing directly monetarily. Any and all methods of contribution are very much appreciated. Thank you so very much to those of you who have already contributed in some way. And thank you in advance to those who are thinking of doing so in the future. Another great way to help support the show is to check out our sponsors. The first sponsor today is Audible. If you go to audibletrial.com/LKT, You will receive a free 30-day trial of Audible and a free audiobook of your choice. Stick around till the end of the show, and I will recommend a book that you might consider using that credit on. And the other sponsor today is HostGator, the hosting company that I have gladly used for many years. If you go to hostgator.com/LKT, you will receive a special discount for listeners of Let's Know Things that makes their already reasonable prices even more reasonable. All right, let's get back to the show. On January 20th of 2017, a man named Richard Spencer was sucker-punched while being interviewed on camera. He was in the process of telling the interviewer about a Pepe the Frog pin he was wearing on his lapel when a masked man jumped into the frame and punched him in the face, causing bystanders to step back and shout in surprise, and causing Spencer to retreat. As the video continues, the attacker walks away, and the camera turns and catches Spencer fixing his hair as he walks in the opposite direction with a cluster of supporters. This video would not, I think, have caused much of a hubbub if Richard Spencer was widely considered to be a good person. If that was the case, it would have been one more piece of outrage media circulated around the internet, much like other recent videos of, for example, newscasters being attacked and even shot while reporting live on camera. A truly sad moment to add to the pile of other truly sad moments. This video also, I think, would not have been such a big deal had Spencer been some kind of violent criminal. If he was known to be a murderer or a rapist, for instance, it's a safe bet that all the feels felt while watching him get sucker-punched would have been good feels. He would have seemed deserving of the punch he received, and perhaps even more than that. But Spencer, as far as I know, is neither of these things. Instead, he is a non-criminal person who espouses ideas that a large number of people find to be immensely repugnant. He is the leader of the National Policy Institute, which is a small official-sounding group that supports a so-called ethnically pure state for so-called Americans of European descent. At a well-publicized post-Trump inauguration meeting of this group, he referred to white people as children of the sun and led attendees in a Nazi salute and then shouted, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory." This is not a newly adopted, trendy ideology for Spencer, by the way. He is not writing the modern wave of white power. He actually helped create it. In 2010, he started an online journal called Alternative Right, where he promoted white nationalism. There and elsewhere, Spencer has said that he supports what he calls, quote, peaceful ethnic cleansing, end quote. What he means by this is anyone's guess, but I think most interpretations would provide us with ample cause to be wary of this guy and his ideas. So that is Richard Spencer, not a criminal, in the US at least, though he is apparently banned from both free visa Schengen zone countries in Europe and the UK for attempting to hold outlawed white supremacist events in those regions. So he's not a criminal in the US, but he's also not a very good guy, by most modern standards anyway. So that context in mind, the article that I want to unspool today comes from The Guardian, and it is entitled, "Is Punching Richard Spencer Inciting Violence or American as Apple Pie?" This piece talks about Spencer and his ideas, and goes a bit further into what happened after the video of him being punched, which was recorded by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, was posted online. For a lot of people, myself included if I'm being honest, seeing Spencer get punched was deeply satisfying. There's a visceral pleasure in seeing those who we consider to be very bad people getting what we perceive to be their comeuppance. I had heard of this guy before and had read some of his, in my opinion, truly small-minded work. And to watch him grin and glad hand and try so hard to get positive PR for his white supremacist cause, only to be punched right in the face by a masked stranger on camera, was invigorating. It felt like a movie villain getting his just desserts. That the recording of this punch then became a viral meme, several memes actually, made it even more satisfying. In one strain of this meme, images of Spencer being punched were posted next to images of famous US characters like Indiana Jones and Captain America punching Nazis. In another meme, the punch video was recut and mixed with music, with the punch landing just as the bass drops in some catchy tune, and the punch itself is then sometimes shown over and over again in time with the beat of the music. But after that moment of celebration came all the think pieces, and around that same time, there also emerged some more thoughtful and less reactive knee-jerk tweets and posts on social media. There were, of course, more Nazi punching memes, but there were also reminders that violent protest is less effective than nonviolent protest, and that those on the receiving end of violence will very often claim victimhood, which then, in the eyes of the public, positions their aggressor as the villain. The last thing that we need, it was said by some, is to be portrayed as violent protesters, especially since protests against the newly minted President Trump and the white supremacists who tend to support him were expected to continue for quite some time. To quote a tweet from one of the writers for the Captain America comic, Nick Spencer, no relation to the white supremacist Richard Spencer, quote, "Today is difficult, but cheering violence against speech, even of the most detestable, disgusting variety, is not a look that will age well," end quote. We've got some ground to cover here. I'm going to spin this out into a few main topics and then try to tackle them one at a time. So first and foremost, who was the masked sucker puncher in the video? To answer that question, we have to go back to the early 1920s, when fascist groups were beginning to cohere into a political movement around Europe, especially in places like Italy and Germany. Nationalists were being flogged into a frenzy by charismatic leaders decrying their culture's victimhood. Hitler called out his nation's mistreatment post-World War I, while Mussolini stirred up feelings of irredentism, which is a word that means the desire to take back something which has been stolen, whether that means land or perceived stature, among his countrymen. These fascists, by their very nature, were militant in the sense that they valued top-down organization, and in the sense that they were bristling with weapons and hankering for a fight. To counter the burgeoning threat that these fascists represented, a ragtag group of anti-fascists began to coalesce, at first around socialist ideologies, but later as a broader movement that included Democrats, Christians, and, in some cases, just simple small-town militias, representing regions that didn't want to be overrun by fascist thugs. In the decades since World War II, many anti-fascist movements around the world, from Slovenia to Sweden to the United States, have been called left-wing extremists or communists. The former label is somewhat subjective, but the communist label does bear some truth historically, in that the original anti-fascists from the 20s, up until the Soviets aligned themselves with the Nazis, which changed some things, did tend to sympathize with the communist cause. How true that communist-leaning claim is today is a little harder to say, as anti-fascist movements around the world are very diverse and a little less unified than they were back then. The masked figure who sucker-punched Richard Spencer on camera is supposedly a member of a US-based Antifa group, Antifa being the modern slang for anti-fascist. Though because that individual is trying to avoid a legal manhunt conducted by Spencer and his people, I do not believe that the specific group he's a part of has been divulged. So what do these modern Antifa groups do? What do they represent? If you Google around a bit and take a look at some of their websites divided by region or by city, you'll find a lot of examples of their work. In addition to inciting organized political movement against fascists wherever possible, they will also sometimes go to pro-fascist events and cause a ruckus. And they are generally considered to be ready to get physical, if necessary. They are primed to face violence with violence. They will also sometimes dox fascists who live and organize in their cities, which is to say, they find out who these fascists are and post information about them online, including things like where they live and where they work. That is doxxing, D-O-X. Now, doxing, in some ways, could be perceived as an even more potent and threatening act than a punch to the face. A public punch is a public punch, but it's not a threat that follows you home. A common tactic of fascists and so-called alt-right trolls is to dox their enemies, which often leads to threatening phone calls and defaced cars and threats of violence, terrified families. The Antifas, then, are a standard political movement, but sometimes they move into the black ops versus black ops territory, meaning they will use dirty tricks against those who use dirty tricks. They will bully the bullies. They threaten those who would threaten. Knowing this about the Antifa movement and their tactics which are aimed at silencing those who would say horrible fascist things, it's important, I think, that we ask ourselves whether that's okay. Is the silencing of free speech ever justified? And is it even effective to the ends that we hope to achieve? The Battle of Cable Street was a London-based melee between fascists and anti-fascists back in 1936. This conflict pitted the British Union of Fascists, yes, there was a British Union of Fascists, and the police, who were sworn to defend the BUF's public demonstration, against a group of anti-fascist demonstrators made up of members from local Jewish, Irish, socialist, anarchist, and communist groups. There were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 fascists, around 6,000 police, and about 20,000 anti-fascists in attendance at this March of the Fascists. The anti-fascist protesters first attempted to block the parade route of fascist demonstrators, but they were broken up by the police, which then resulted in a violent riot. What is significant about this event, for the purposes of this conversation, is that both sides, both the fascists and the anti-fascists, claimed victory after the Battle of Cable Street. The anti-fascists believed that they had shown their numbers and passion to be overwhelming and that they were willing to fight for their cause, which was important to rally the troops. But the fascist group actually enjoyed a growth in numbers after the event. A great deal of attention was drawn to their cause as a result of what transpired, and they were seen by some, including some members of the press, to be the intellectual idealists with unpopular ideas, struggling to be heard amidst a wave of intolerant and violent enemies. Now think about that. These fascists were anti-Semitic. They were anti-anyone not white and British. They were pro-setting back the clock in terms of human rights and societal expectations. And they were seen by many to be the victims of intolerance because they were the ones being silenced by violence in this instance. Freedoms are tenuous things because if everyone has them, some people will attempt to use their freedoms to strip the freedoms from everyone else, or maybe just those they disagree with. It's conveniently forgotten or left out of the stories that we tell ourselves that Hitler came into power through a democratic system before he tore that system apart and replaced it with a fascist personality cult. President Paul von Hindenburg of Germany didn't want to run for a second term of office. He was in poor health, he was 84 years old, but he was so alarmed by Adolf Hitler and what the man was saying that he decided that he would run again just to defeat Hitler and he did win, preventing Hitler from becoming president. So Hindenburg won the 1932 presidential election, but because of influence trading and political maneuvering, which were natural components of their democratic system, he was compelled to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany the following year. In 1933, the Reichstag, which was Germany's House of Parliament, was set on fire, and a young Dutch communist was accused of perpetrating the act by Nazi Party members who, at that point, had taken control, via Hitler's position, of many key governmental positions. Whether or not this young man was actually the arsonist will probably never be known, because the Nazis controlled the government bodies that were tasked with investigating the event and capturing the arsonist and doling out justice to him. And the Reichstag fire led to the Reichstag Fire Decree, which was issued by Hindenburg but produced and pushed through the legal process by Hitler. And this decree essentially nullified key civil liberties that German citizens enjoyed, which allowed the government, which in practice at that point meant the Nazis, to completely suppress any publications or statements or actions considered to be unfriendly to the Nazi cause. They were under attack by outside enemies, it was claimed, and they needed to make sure that anti-government forces were unable to hide behind things like freedom and liberty. It was claimed that this would be a temporary situation, resulting from a horrible terrorist act, but of course, as we know, that did not turn out to be the case. If you've ever been curious about how a dictatorship could grow out of a democracy, take a look at the Reichstag Fire Decree and the series of events that led up to it. Because of this sequence of events, Hitler was able to use the systems of democracy against democracy, taking power under one system and then tearing that system apart, turning it into something very, very different. The historical example of Hitler's rise is one of the more complete and documented events of this kind, but democracy is used against democracy all the time. Every time a law is passed by an elected official, which reinforces the power and influence and wealth of those within that system and that of their friends, that is democracy being used against democracy. We see the same tendency in free speech, the liberty to say what we want being used against that very same liberty. The aforementioned practice of doxxing, for instance, allows an aggressor to say things, to put information out on the internet, to publish images and words in a newsletter, and by doing so, they are able to silence someone else. They can frighten someone who disagrees with them into shutting up or going into hiding. They can force an immigrant family to move out of the neighborhood or harass anti-fascists into staying away from public events or not voicing their opinions. Free speech can be used as a type of violence, and sometimes that means yelling fire in a crowded theater. But more often, I think, it means finding out where a political opponent's kid goes to school and posting that information on Twitter. It's chilling sometimes, seeing how weaponized speech can become. Sometimes free speech as a weapon is used by citizens against citizens, but sometimes it is part of a larger project conducted by the government against citizens. COINTELPRO, which is a portmanteau of counterintelligence program, is the designation of many covert, often illegal FBI projects that were designed to watch and infiltrate and discredit political organizations in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights movement figures, and the Black Panther Party, and anti-Vietnam War protesters, and feminist organizations, and Puerto Rican independence groups, and the U.S. Communist Party, among others, were wiretapped and followed and surveilled, and in some cases threatened as part of this program. In one famous and relatively well-known instance of the application of COINTELPRO, the FBI anonymously mailed a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. alongside recorded evidence of his sexual indiscretions in an attempt to convince him to commit suicide. It's also documented that the FBI did their best to widen the rift between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad by spreading rumors and sparking internal debates. And these conflicts eventually led to Malcolm X's assassination by the Nation of Islam. Here we have another example, or many examples, really, of words being used as weapons, of free speech being used to deny others free speech, or at least to attach negative consequences to people using their free speech. The FBI very often looms and lurks, but for this project at least, it didn't have to fire any bullets or even pull a gun. The threat that they would release certain private information publicly was enough. I've spoken before about how the freedom of speech is so vital, but often runs into the issue where one person's freedom of speech can sometimes deny the same to other people. We have seen this happen in the repression of minorities, for instance, or even the pervasive racism in some schools or workplaces. Yes, you have the freedom to say whatever you like, including making crude jokes or calling people offensive names. But the consequence of your doing so is that their freedoms are impeded upon in practice, if not through any type of legislation or rule. The implied consequences of them speaking up for them are often not worth facing. They could fight back, but not everyone wants to face the potential of a physical conflict with a bully just to stand up for themselves. Not everyone believes that the best way to answer a threat is with a threat, or an insult with an insult. Now that said, there are very real long-term negative consequences to limiting speech, even with the best of intentions. We could limit speech to ensure that no one is being trampled by bullies and racists and sexists and homophobes and fascists. But if we do, what words would we limit? Will these words always be limited, even in private conversation? Or will they only be limited in some circumstances? What punishment will be allotted for using forbidden words? What happens when new words come to be used as insults or threats? Who will keep the list of words that we can no longer use? And how will that be made available to the public so that we know what we can and cannot say? And who will update that list as the creativity of those who insult and threaten for fun grows? How long will it take before our reserve of vocabulary words is cut in half? How long until we have very few words that we can still safely speak? And how long before even those words disappear? What happens then? This example is only kind of an exaggeration. I think it's very unlikely that in the near future we would run out of words to speak. But I think the point is well made that if we do start banning words, if we start limiting our ability to communicate, the negative consequences of that, on the broad scale at least, far outweigh the potential benefits of banning those words. And that ties into another point that I believe I've mentioned on this podcast before, that we are all predisposed to certain authoritarian tendencies. And what I mean by that is, given the option, most of us, I think, would jump at the chance to kick our political opponents out of power for a while so that we could pass all those wonderful laws that we've been waiting to get on the books. A lot of us would also gleefully ban all the words we don't like from common speech, and perhaps even the groups that oppose us and our ideas. We would limit their rights in some way. And we would feel completely morally justified in doing so in most cases, even as we show ourselves in doing so to be very well-meaning fascists. It can take a lot of effort to rid ourselves of this predisposition to want to crush our opposition, to remove their power to do anything. It takes effort to remind ourselves that pluralistic societies, democracies filled with people who have different ideas, require a diversity of people and perspectives to function optimally. If we rid ourselves of conflict, of disagreement, then we have also missed the point of democracy. Fascists do not only look like Hitler, they also look like the Democrat who wants all Republicans blocked from the voting booth, and the Republican who wants the same in reverse. We are all prone to authoritarianism when it favors our ideology, but we are equally horrified by it when it favors someone else's ideas, someone else's collection of biases. This propensity is a problem because it means we feel morally secure in banning things that those who disagree with us do and say. And in some cases, these desires can make sense in the moment because something horrible is being done. And banning a particular word or denying a particular person the right to speak can seem like the best way to stop the abuse, to stop an ongoing instance of abuse. But banning ideas and the expression of ideas requires an infrastructure for leveling and enforcing such bans. And that means that those tools, those exact same tools that we use to silence an opposing aggressor, could be used against us and our words, our beliefs, our ideologies as well in the future. If we don't keep free speech and liberties absolute for everyone, even the douchebags, then not only are we dabbling with crypto-fascism, we are also building tools that will almost certainly be used against us someday. This means that there are no easy solutions to many of these speech-related problems that we face today. My general feeling, for what it's worth, is that there is still a lot to be gained in focusing on social costs to taking malevolent action. We can focus on societal consequences, for example, for doing douchey things rather than creating legal solutions which might come back to bite us later. This, in practice, means ensuring that people who use free speech as a weapon to deny others the same are identifiable and able to be socially held accountable, not by law, but by public sentiment. Becoming a social pariah stripped of credibility would be a compelling enough reason for many people to stop trolling and abusing, I think. But for that to happen, the consequences would have to be made more clear, I think, and the denizens and platforms of the internet would need to become more savvy in how they both revealed this information and in how they used it. It's like a doomsday machine for mutually assured destruction. It is necessary that the bad guy know that this failsafe is in place because we're trying to prevent them from doing stuff, not to end the world. Now, all that said, I should mention that I am very much aware that there's a very good chance I would feel differently about a lot of this if I were being actively targeted in this way. With this and with everything, it's a very privileged position to be able to look at the big picture when some people are being hurt, because it means that you yourself are probably not in the trenches there next to them, actively being fired upon. I would generally hold that being able to take the larger context into consideration with this type of thing is a luxury that allows for the building of a more resilient social system and set of legal frameworks, but I can absolutely understand why some people might take issue with that assessment and with taking purely the long view that building legal tools to limit free speech is a negative thing, particularly if they themselves are currently dodging bullets that such legal actions might actually help block. This, I think, is worth keeping in mind, even for those of us not currently in the trenches, because we might someday find ourselves there, but also because solutions which fail to acknowledge the short-term downsides in favor of purely long-term benefits are inherently flawed solutions. They're leaving out part of the solution that we need to see. So this idea, this opinion that I have expressed, like many solutions and opinions that I propose on this show, is inherently flawed in at least that one respect, and quite possibly more than just that one respect. And as such, it warrants further thought. So take it with a grain of salt. Now, one more quick flurry of relevant questions to that topic before we move on to the next broad topic. Should a tolerant system tolerate intolerance? Should a democracy empower those who clearly intend to end democracy? Should we adhere to the ideal of democracy if in doing so we would catalyze the end of that very system? And might there be circumstances in which ending democracy would actually be a good thing? I personally think that it is the best of all the governing systems that we've tried so far, but I could always be wrong about that. And I do think it's worth hoping, at least, that we will come up with something even better at some point in the future. And in that case, wouldn't it be good that there is a mechanism within the structure of democracy that allows that structure to be disrupted or even destroyed so that that new thing can be installed? That last point in particular is worth thinking about, but it probably goes beyond the scope of this episode. So let's move on to the next big topical question. Can violence ever be justified when it comes to ideological disagreements? I get it. Punching Nazis is fun. The idea of punching Nazis is fun. It's a great visual. It makes those who feel disconcerted by, or even afraid of, what's happening right now feel a little bit stronger. It grants them some resolve. In some ways, it humiliates the fascists who are stomping around trying to act so tough all the time. And that video of neo-Nazi Spencer being punched, as I mentioned before, is viscerally satisfying on a lot of levels. But what happens if this becomes okay? Like, what happens if it becomes common or even legal? Yes, officer, I punched him, but he's a neo-Nazi, so by this standard, the standard that it's okay to punch really abysmal people, who can we punch? How much of a Nazi must they be before they are punch-worthy in the legal sense? Neo-Nazis, just like people who fall under any broad label, differ in their specific beliefs. So which beliefs in particular must they hold? And how firmly must they hold them? And then how hard can the punch be? Is a shove more or less acceptable than a punch? And can you kick them in the crotch? And then a broader question that I think is worth asking at this point. Has anyone ever been convinced of anything by being punched in the face or crotch kicked? Can you win a debate by shooting someone? Or are you merely silencing arguments that you have failed to counter? When violence of any kind occurs, have we in essence given up the debate and resorted to something else entirely? It is unlikely that a conflict that is escalated to punching people we find to be ideologically objectionable will be limited to one side punching the other, at least not for long. Both sides will get in on that action, and the isolated punches will lead to riots. Weapons will be used. Bullets will be fired. At some point, this type of conflict looks less like ideologically opposed groups trying to convince the public and each other of the superiority of their beliefs, and more like opposing forces going to war. And we've done the war thing. We in the US actually have no small amount of experience with the war thing. So we in particular should know what the consequences of that type of escalation can look like. But what do you do when the other side starts beating and shooting you? And let's assume that you do not wish to spark a conflict that spins out into a war. One common bit of wisdom says to turn the other cheek, and that can and has worked a lot throughout history. But what happens when you let them hit you, stab you, shoot you, and they don't stop, and they never stop, and they just keep abusing, they just keep oppressing? What's often left out of that turn the other cheek ideology is that to work, it requires that the attacking force has some sense of shame, and that there is some kind of outside party with the capacity to act, to rein them in and to stop the violence. Peaceful protest, in short, requires a system of checks and balances to work. Sometimes this means other branches of government that are empowered to pull the reins on oversteps. Sometimes it means a free press that is capable of reporting abuses accurately to the wider world. Whatever the specifics, it means that we have the power to either stop the abusers in their tracks or make sure that they know they will be remembered for the horrible things that they have done, and that their beliefs will be forever tarnished by those crimes that they have committed. Lacking such checks and balances, we often regress to physical conflict. The pillars of democracy provide us with the means to fight Nazis without having to punch them. That's one of the benefits of this system. Lacking these pillars, though, violence becomes the only means of combating those who want to enforce their ideals on others. When our mechanisms for punishing the powerful and abusive disappear, our only means of inciting change and disrupting authority is violence. And escalation of violence does not lead to a world that we'd want to live in. And that is a pretty solid argument, I think, for remaining nonviolent and trying to maintain the structures that allow us to maintain nonviolence. But here's that uncomfortable question again about a slightly different topic. Does a strict nonviolent code make sense when the other side wants to end you, to destroy you and your people, and to end the checks and balances and the free press that might stop them and expose them to usurpation in the future? Said another way, is absolute adherence to an ideal worthwhile if the consequence of that adherence is the destruction of everything that allows that ideal to exist? I think while asking and attempting to answer these questions, it's worth taking the time to define very clearly and specifically what winning means to you personally within a given conflict. If winning means getting revenge against someone you see as an oppressor and potentially humiliating them, or getting people who disagree with you or scare you to shut up, punching them could actually be a somewhat practical means to achieving that end. If you hope to achieve a longer-term victory, though, violence very seldom works in the way that we want it to. Not unless you have an army at your back, and even then your actions will probably only lead to more violence in the future, and perhaps a stain on your name and your ideology. You do not convince people of anything by physically attacking them, except perhaps silencing them for now, but in the long term reinforcing their supposition that you are a horrible villain who does villainous things. There's a decent chance that your attempts to physically intimidate will only harden their resolve and their immunity to any arguments you might present in the future, even if those arguments would otherwise be absolutely convincing. You might accidentally crotch kick your ability to spread your ideology if you crotch kick someone who initially disagrees with you. Sucker punches lead to fistfights, which lead to knife fights, which lead to gunfights, which leads to explosives and poisons and all kinds of other inhuman nastiness. How many punches have to be thrown or bullets fired before our actions become just as harmful as those that we are trying to prevent? The answer to that question will be different for everyone, I think, but it's valuable to know where that line is for you and for whatever it is you hope to achieve in the future. This episode and every episode of Let's Know Things is brought to you by its wonderful listeners. If you stop by letsknowthings.com and click on the contribute page, you will find an array of options, different ways that you can help support the show. Leaving a review on iTunes is very helpful, as is sharing the show with a friend. Direct monetary contributions are amazing, as are the other options listed on that page. Another great way to help support the show is to check out these offers from our sponsors. The first sponsor is Audible. If you go to audibletrial.com/LKT, you will receive a free 30-day trial of Audible, and you will receive a free audiobook of your choice from their collection. And it is a massive collection, including many wonderful books. If you do not currently have a book in mind to spend that credit on, might I suggest Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This is an alternative history book that was written, I want to say back in the 60s, maybe 1962. Don't quote me on that. And the premise of the book is, what if the Nazis and Japan, the Axis powers, won World War II rather than the Allied powers, as actually happened in history? And this world that Philip K. Dick builds is compelling and horrifying, and it's absolutely not a feel-good book, but it will make you feel wonderful that this is not what actually happened. And there was recently an Amazon series made based on this book, and the series itself is great. It deviates greatly from the book's storyline, but both the series and the book are wonderful. But the book itself, to me, is in some ways even darker, and in some ways even more horrifying than the version portrayed on screen. So if you're into that kind of thing, if you would like to see how the world could have looked under a fascist dictatorship, and with the two dictatorships, the Japanese and the Nazis, in power, coming to a point where they are starting to eyeball each other as potential next enemies, Man in the High Castle is an excellent option for that very specific desire of yours. Now, you can grab that book at your local library or local indie bookstore. You can get it on your Kindle or your Kobo, but you can also snag yourself a free audiobook copy if you go to audibletrial.com/LKT. And the other sponsor today is HostGator. If you go to hostgator.com/LKT, you will receive a discount off of their already very reasonably priced hosting offerings. Whether you're looking to start a blog or an online portfolio or a website for your business, HostGator is an excellent option, providing all of the services that you will need to complete those projects. This is the hosting company that I have used for many, many years and that I use for all of my online properties, including the aforementioned letsnotethings.com. I cannot say enough good things about them, and if you are looking for those types of services, they are an excellent option, and that's a great way to help out the show as well. HostGator.com/LKT. If you'd like to view the show notes for this episode and every episode, you can do so at letsnotethings.com. While there, you can also sign up for the weekly newsletter that contains a collection of links to interesting things. If you want to learn more about me and my work, including the books that I have written, you can go to colin.io. You can find me pretty much everywhere on the internet at Colin is my name. My blog is exilelifestyle.com. Thank you so much for listening. I am Colin Wright, and I will talk to you again next week.